Welcome to the return of the Science Behind the Magic interview series, and we have our first of this round, Cadwell Turnbull, to my side over here, who's written a bunch of great speculative works. Their debut novel was The Lesson, right here, which we will be talking about today, because I find it very good and also kind of important for the Convergence series that is finishing up this September 16th. We get the third book, so this is the first one, No Gods, No Monsters. We have the second one, We Are the Crisis, and I don't currently have a copy of A Ruin Great and Free, but I'm excited to get it because just regardless of the words inside, these are stunning covers. Like I really
I
love whoever
appreciate
your art
that.
designer is. Like these are
Yeah,
spectacular.
Catherine G. English. Fantastic. I
Yeah, like
have my I have my finished copy of A Ruined Grain of Free here, so I can share it. It is gorgeous.
yes. I
Yeah.
just they're all cohesive, and your publisher made them all the same height, which for us book nerds is like very important.
It's
So
great. Yeah.
So yeah, no. So we're going to talk about that today, and generally, I would like to give you an opportunity to introduce yourself, and specifically, what led you to be an author, either as a part-time occupation or full-time occupation. What got you here?
Okay. So, yeah, I mean, I think I always knew. There was a time before I knew I wanted to be a writer that I thought I was going to be a scientist, and then I ended up writing science fiction, so there you go. Um but yeah, it was pretty early on. I have like a really I think really nice but corny, story for why I decided to be a writer. One of my teachers in middle school assigned us the Diary of Anne Frank to read, and like I tended to do, I procrastinated until the very last minute in reading it, and then I read it, and I was so deeply moved by the story. This was me back on St. Thomas in the Virgin Islands, so this was like a totally different
Yeah,
world to me, but I also just felt a ton of emotion. And I wrote this essay. It just kind of like came right out of me, and like it was the easiest essay ever to write. Um, Not easy because of the content, because it was a difficult context and content, but it was I didn't have to think at all while I was writing it. And so I turned it in, and my teacher was like, "Have you ever thought about being a writer?"
nice.
And I had not even considered that as a profession. I didn't know you could do that. I didn't really have a lot of examples growing up of that, even though I had read, some books. Um, and so that was the first time the idea came to me. And then it just kind of grew from there. It just sprouted. And over the next few years, I just went more and more in that direction. I wrote essays, I wrote fiction. I had like a really bad high school novel I was working on, and then I went to school. I went to undergrad for professional writing. I got my MFA in creative writing, and an MA in linguistics, which was a kind of interesting side quest. And yeah, it was just once I started down that road, I just kept going down that road, and then I got here somehow.
Nice. I mean, you already mentioned kind of one of them, but this is actually a question from one of your biggest fans in my Discord. Is in general your biggest influences of, I mean, it sounds like you like science, so hence science fiction, but like, what are your influences that got you to write the stories that you write? Because I also feel, because I read a lot of general fiction, there is definitely a lot of that craft that you kind of get more in that literary general fiction realm, mixed in
hmm
with your love of the paranormal and sci-fi and things like that. So what are some of your favorite works that have influenced you to get here?
So, I mean, my most like my like the biggest influences on my work are science fiction, fantasy writers and books. So biggest influences Ursula K. Le Guin, specifically her like social science fiction approach, right? Like she's really focused on people and their social relationships, on cultures, and she goes very deep in that direction. She's also like very, I would consider it to be very literary. There's she's much more interested in small moments between, like if she's writing a first contact novel, for example, she's more interested in the small moments between two different beings than anything blowing up, or action sequences or whatever you might call it. And so that's a really big influence for me. Octavia Butler, I arrived at later, but it's also a huge influence to me. I didn't start reading Butler until grad school, unfortunately. But once I started reading her, she became a huge influence. I would say N.K. Jemisin is also an influence. Ted Chiang. So a lot of people on the genre side. I have some people on the literary side ish. So Emily St. John Mandel, I think, is a new big influence, and I also was a huge fan. And things shift with authors all the time, but I was a huge fan of Alice Munro's work, and her attention to domestic life, to small moments, and so huge influence. Munro is kind of on the outs for various reasons, but still continues to be an influence on my work. And so yeah, I mean, I feel like that's a pretty good broad list of the things that influence what I'm doing.
It definitely makes sense why you're quickly have flown to the heights of my kind of favorite authors list, because you've basically listed 3 of my favorite authors in your list with Jemisin, Chang, and Butler. Although now I have to ask you, so what is your favorite Butler? And then also as a follow-up, I've only read The Left Hand of Darkness by Ursula K. Le Guin, and I know I need to get back to her, but what would be your recommendation?
A quiz. So when I was working on a lesson, I read the Xenogenesis trilogy by Butler.
That
And
makes a lot
so
of sense.
I would say and what was funny about it is when I was working on the lesson, this was when I was in my MFA. I started turning in parts of the lesson. I didn't know what it was yet. And my advisor, John Kessel, he said, he recommended strongly that I read Butler. And he was like, you should read these books in particular. And then I read those books and I was mortified. I was like, oh my God, she is doing a lot of what I'm trying to do with this book. And she's doing it like on, Butler level. I'll just put it that way, right? And so I almost was just like, well, I mean, might as well give up, right? Because tough act to follow. And Kessel was very encouraging. He said, like, there's nothing new. And it makes sense that you'd be interested in similar things, because you're thinking about similar things. And so just pay homage to Butler, honor her in the work somehow, and continue doing what you're doing. And so that's what I did. So I would say that's high up there, but my absolute favorite thing from Butler is Bloodchild.
That
That's
one's a
specifically that short story. Yeah.
yeah. Well, and it's so funny because isn't that the one she wrote right before Xenogenesis? I think she wrote that one while she was getting ready for it, because I think that's in her note in there, and it's just. I think it's a shame that so many people don't get to her alien works. I mean, I love all of the Butler, but they definitely get more into Kindred and Parabellum of the Sower and things like that, because they're a little more accessible in terms of.
Yeah.
I mean, they're all uncomfortable, but Butler can get very uncomfortable very quickly.
Right. And Bloodchild is extremely uncomfortable. I just also think it's just an immaculate, perfect story. Like she sets no foot wrong throughout that entire thing. And it's really powerful. It's really nebulous. There's a lot of ambiguity in the relationships between the alien and the human characters in a way that I think is to its service. Like I think that oftentimes we write or we present first contact narratives with this kind of black and white framing, and that's not there. That Butler is doing something that I think it might be at the time it was written just like entirely interesting and new, but I still think if you read that today, it's like one of her, like all of her stuff reads like someone wrote it yesterday.
Yeah,
but that story in particular. Yeah. That story in particular just feels like it's just miles ahead of its time even now, which is I don't know, just a testament to her gifts.
So I kind of want to just make sure everyone kind of knows. So we're now kind of talking a lot in conversation with the lesson, because the lesson is your alien invasion story. But I do think, because I was going back in time and looking at reviews, and I was on the bookish internet when the lesson came out, and I was hearing so many weird things about it, and I finally picked it up for myself. And you choose to look at right before the invasion and then 5 years after the invasion. That is your choice of framing for this story. And in this, you were talking about Le Guin and how domestic those scenes are, and same with one of your other influences. And that is my favorite thing about the lesson, is how you are focusing on the day-to-day minutia of this tapestry of characters that you brought together. And this has happened a lot with a lot of my favorite authors. Simon Jimenez, he said this also with his book, The Vanished Birds. He was like, it kind of came together at my MFA. You know, I was just writing things. And Karen Lord said the same thing for The Best of All Possible Worlds. Those are two of my favorite books. So it's kind of makes sense that you were kind of piecing this all together, but you didn't quite know what type of story it would be. But you keep that tapestry approach in the rest of your books as well. So why do you choose to do that? Even though, I mean, I love it. It's my personal taste, but you know that that's probably not the taste of the average reader, right? Everyone's kind of used to one point of view, two or three, kind of traditional in our sci-fi sphere. So how do you pull it off, and why are you drawn to that type of connectivity tissue sort of thing?
It's a very good question. I wanna answer a question before I forget that you asked that I didn't answer was which Le Guin book do I recommend you read first? That isn't The Left Hand of Darkness.
Yeah, I've already read that one, so.
So it's a tough book, right? So it's my favorite book of all time is a Le Guin book. It's The Dispossessed.
I
And
almost bought it the other day.
I think that book is amazing. It's also, a difficult book. There's things that happen in that book that are quite difficult. But I mention this all the time when people ask me, what my top books are. I just, some people struggle with that answer. I have really easy ones to grab, right? But my wife was interested in it for that reason, and she tried The Dispossessed, and it was a challenging book for her. It's not an easy book. And so I would say I would make that recommendation with that grain of salt, right? Like just consider the fact that it's doing a lot. There's a lot of like philosophy. It's dense. People are talking a bunch. And so
I love a classic sci-fi where everyone's just in a room talking to each other, though. It's so fun.
Yeah. Several rooms, several planets talking, right? So I recommend that. To answer your question about the mosaic structure of the books, the lesson was definitely by accident. So it wasn't something that I had intended to start. I was curious about the first part of the lesson that arrived or came into existence was Let Them Talk. It was the Derek at work, and he works for Mira, who just happens to be an alien, and then they go out and they get a meal, and it was a very quiet thing. And then through the course of that story, Derek interacts with family members, and I just got interested in his family, and I started writing from his sister's POV. Eventually I started writing from his grandmother's POV. And as I was just like, the way I would describe it is like kind of walking through a house and opening rooms. Things started to just come together. And it wasn't like until like I was like a third through that I started noticing like a plot thread, like a thing that was building. And it wasn't until a third through that all my mentors at my MFA were like, this is a novel. And I was like, is it? Okay. And so I sat down and I was like, what's here already? Where is that stuff pointing towards? Where does it want to go? What would be the climax of this story, etc., right? What would be the resolution? And so I started building that stuff out, and I didn't really finish the book until after my MFA, but I got like through, I would say, 2/3 of it. I was very interested in that structure because I'm interested in community.
Yeah.
And so it, to me, just felt very natural to kind of not be focused on just one person. I do return to people throughout the book, but I'm curious. I'm like, oh, well, how does Jackson feel about this? Or how does Aubrey feel about this? Like, I'm just like moving around because it feels to me very natural to get the perspective of someone else and someone else and someone else, and how they're relating to this big thing that's happening, because everyone is going to have a different relationship to the thing. Derek has his relationship to the thing because he reads sci-fi. He comes from that nerd world where this might be kind of neat, you know, like, and so that is complicated for him as the story goes on, but not everybody has that same relationship. Like his grandmother doesn't have that same relationship to the aliens and to the idea of aliens, and so thinking about aliens in relation to sexuality, aliens in relation to like personal growth or sense of self or identity, aliens in relation to faith, right? Like all of these things became important to think about and look at, and that I just knew those things wouldn't matter to everyone to the same degree. So it makes sense to kind of explore these different themes through these different people. Yeah. And then once I did it once and I was like, I really like this structure. I really like what it's doing. I really like its focus. I mean, and sometimes it's like that, right? You do something and you're kind of like figuring out what you're doing. You're in the mud and you're figuring out what you're doing as you're going. And then something kind of snaps into place and you get this kind of unified theory about like, well, this is what I'm doing and this is why I like doing it. And I didn't get to that point until after I had like almost finished the lesson and I had, you know, and it was almost a thing. And then I was like, oh, there's things I would want to try differently here. And so it became like an obsession. It was like, okay, I wrote it this way. These things worked about it. These other things I would try differently. And I was also curious, how would I structure this if the intent was from the beginning, right? Instead of like the intent materializing out of the process, right? And so No Gods, No Monsters, the Convergent Saga came out of this like, I want to write about the formation of a community over 3 books. I want them to be individuals and then small groups and then a community. And I was like, how do I trace that path? How do I do that intentionally? And so I started building it brick by brick. And I was invested in that, or I was interested in that because I think that like social change, when you actually look at it honestly in the world, it doesn't look like, for example, social change in a fantasy book where there's just like this really cool person. He has like a long coat or something, and special magic. He's chosen in some way. He's marked by the villain. Anyway, there isn't just one exceptional human fighting against all things and changing the world. That's not how it looks in our world. It usually is interaction or a dance or an argument between a bunch of different players, a bunch of different groups, a bunch of different communities that are trying to move society in some way. And society moves through a combination of efforts. So it doesn't move all the way in one person's direction. It kind of does this kind of ping ponging, right? And we're seeing that now, right? Like our world ping pongs. And so I wanted to write something that felt true to that. And I also wanted to write about people who aren't always prioritizing the things that outside observer might prioritize, right? So like there's characters that are part of the narrative in the Convergent Saga that are just interested in their own lives. And I wanted that to have value and weight in a similar way to the person that is interested in trying to maneuver the world, right? Like both of those people matter, and I'm not making a value judgment of who is above who there. So that's a long way of hopefully I'm answering the question you're asking.
No, I think, I mean, it makes sense to me. I don't know if other people, but to me, that makes sense. So I am satisfied. So I have a few more questions about the lesson before I dive into a lot of my Convergent Saga questions, just because Convergent Saga, that's where I first met you, was No Gods, No Monsters, not met you, but consumed your works. And so one is, why St. Thomas, other than, I mean, obviously that's where you're from. So sometimes people just write about where they're from, but I was curious if there were other advantages to putting it on an island in the Caribbean, or, is it just because it was a comfortable place to, be around in the mud like you were talking about? And also, since it is an alien invasion story and you like sci-fi, what is your favorite alien invasion story?
Oh, okay. This is good. Okay. So I'll answer the first question first. So the lesson was inspired by a dream, like an extremely vivid dream. I have like maybe a handful of extremely vivid dreams that are in my life. And this one, it's so vivid that there are characters and you feel their internal motivations, all of this like a story in dream form. And it was about this small town, so not the Virgin Islands. And aliens were there, but aliens looked like people. And the only way that you could, differentiate between them was just the dynamics within the town, how people treated certain people-looking people, and then also just how those people responded. So so what was true about what became the Ina in this dream was that they had like this like really outsized reaction to threat. So if they felt threatened, they responded hyper violently. Um, and that created all kind of tensions within the town. There was a mirror analog in the dream, like wildly. There was a mirror analog. There was a Derek analog. Um, but it didn't look like me. It was small town. It was like something you might have watched on the WB. Maybe not the WB because of how violent it
CW.
was. Yeah, right. It was something you watch on TV, and I woke up and it stuck with me. It didn't work on it right away, but when I was in my MFA, I was writing these very abstract, really out there stories about like a cosmology that becomes important to the Convergent saga. And my mentor once again was encouraged me to write more about home. And I didn't really have a lot of examples of fiction about home. And so it was one of the first times that I actually had like my own soul searching moment where I was like, oh, I'm not writing about where I'm from because I've been so, I don't want to use indoctrinated might be a strong word, but I've been so influenced by the fiction and the media, the TV, the films that I consume that when I write, I tend to write about people that are not me. And Let Them Talk was my first experiment. It was it was a test. It was like, okay, let me take this idea, this vivid dream that I had and transplant it to the Virgin Islands. Let me see what happens. And it was the most, satisfying, um, like writing, drafting, revising experience of my young writing life. Like there was a life there that was never there before in my stories. And it was because I was pulling a lot from me, in a way that I didn't before. And so there was like, to me, like a lot to chew on, a lot of depth. And it just came from that impulse. And then as it grew, I started thinking about all of the, like the high level thematic reasons why it would be useful to have an alien first contact story set in the Virgin Islands, or set in a place that is in New York or DC or LA, right? Where the assumption is that those places are stand-ins for humanity as a whole. Um, what's interesting about the Virgin Islands is that the Virgin Islands at no point in the story sees itself as a stand-in for humanity. It sees itself an, as its own place, its own context, and its own struggle in relation to other powers. So it's not just the aliens that have arrived at Ina. There's also a relationship, a tense relationship with America, right? Because it's U.S. Virgin Islands, and you know, there's this kind of push and pull between all of these bigger forces. The Virgin Islands also sees itself as having a history of being colonized, and so that experience of having superpowers, I'll put that in quote, um, you know, jockeying for ownership and the passing of hands between these various different competing forces informs the way that they view the Ina, um, which is unique, right? It's unique. It's not the same way that so like if the Ina dropped down in LA, they wouldn't have that same response. Um, if we were talking about a generic LA story.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, like it was something that came out of like just curiosity once again. And then as I was working on it, all of these like really great like thematic things started showing up. Like it just was, the story was interested in things that was meaty and exciting, and so I just leaned in those directions.
I mean, that is one of my favorite things about the lesson. And I think, not to say that people don't read books with the best of intentions, but I do think like the average reader was thrown by it because they're used to the alien invasion being associated with extreme fear. Like we're talking Independence Day, right? Or something like that. I'm like, yeah, but this is a place that like every century or so, some force comes in and upheaves their lives. This isn't the same as like, I live in Cleveland, Ohio. We've never been invaded in like 300 years. Like that's not a thing we're going to think about. So I think you mastered that and like really made it about the people. I've never been to that part of the world. I've been to other islands in the Caribbean and South America, but I truly felt like you were welcoming me into a place I'd never been before, and I really appreciated it.
Oh,
So,
thank you.
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like in those like larger first contact stories, it's about eradication, right? Like the fear is that the aliens will eradicate humanity. And it's always weird because these aliens have super advanced technology, and they show up and they actually seem really infantile or quite petty, right? Like there's this like there's not a lot of nuance to the treatment of the aliens. I'm talking mostly about film. Like
Yeah.
books are much better with this.
Yeah, we have so
Um,
many alien invasion books, but for movies, it's usually the blockbuster
yeah,
ones.
yeah. And I was responding at that time. I hadn't read a ton of First Contact. I was responding very directly to those things. But for the Virgin Islands, I feel like the fear is suppression, the fear is erasure, like those kinds of things are more of the fear, and so it worked really good, like metaphorically. But I also just wanted to create an alien race that had its own like complication and nuance, that they had their own interests, and that it wasn't necessarily human centered. They could care less, really, but it was like, okay, these are the intelligent beings on this planet. We will negotiate just so that things could go smoothly. We don't need it to go smoothly, but it's convenient for us. And so it was fun to kind of play with that too.
So then your favorite alien invasion story, movie or book, either one.
Now it's the Sparrow by Mary Doria Russell. This the Sparrow, and especially its sequel, Children of God. Um, when the lesson was coming out, there was a lot of like people were making a lot of connections to that book, and I had not read it, and then I read it way after the book came out. I was like, this was really at another moment of when I was reading Butler. I was like, this is really good. Oh man. And The Sparrow is really amazing, but Children of God, the sequel, I think is one of the rare sequels that I feel elevates the original and is like incredible in its own right. It's one of my favorite books I've read um recently. It's just really smart, and its aliens are really interesting, and they don't look like other aliens I've seen. They're very, very different. And the 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 point of contact, or the contact conflict between humans and aliens is very nuanced, and is explored in this really beautiful, complicated way. And it has this like a big part of the book is about faith, but it has this really interesting agnostic exploration of faith that I think is like makes it like just a really powerful book slash series. Yeah, that's my favorite right now.
Book number 2 added to my TBR because that sounds. I've never heard of that author, but I'm very well read in both genres, but I'm much more well read in fantasy than science fiction. I'm always still getting my sea legs there. So
She's not really a science fiction writer. And
okay.
so that was what was interesting. She writes a lot of historical fiction. She writes about faith a lot, but she doesn't write about science fiction a lot. And what was interesting, I was just reading this today because I'm writing something about the books. Um, People were trying to put those books into, they were like, oh, it's not science fiction, it's philosophical fiction or whatever. And she was like, no, 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 it's science fiction. Um, which was surprising and just like a huge breath of fresh air for like a non-typical genre writer to just claim it so strongly,
Yeah.
that it was. And it really is like it's very much you can't read it without the lens of science fiction. It's doing a lot of like it's using the stuff of science fiction to talk
Yeah,
about,
it's
you know,
using a lot
this
of the
this
tools
person.
and stuff like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's nice. That is always a breath of fresh air. I always feel like there's always a lot of general fiction, and I like general fiction, but they'll like use like time travel, and it's just like this one little thing, or they'll use like, an individual element, and then I don't know. Then I'll have books that I think are like, well, it's not a bad book, but I don't know if it's science fiction, or I'll have books that are science fiction, but everyone will say everything but it's a science fiction book. So now we're going to switch to the Convergence Saga. So just to remind everyone, starts with No Gods, No Monsters, which I would say that if you are someone who gets scared of trilogies, you could maybe read No Gods, No Monsters on its own. I do not say that about We Are the Crisis. If you don't have the third book after We Are the Crisis, you have probably been mad at Cadwell Turnbull for a few years now. Because I finished We Are the Crisis like a month ago, and I was going to wait a few weeks to start A Ruin Great and Free. And I had the arc, so I just started right away because I'm like, that is a cliffhanger. And I would like to know how it ends. But although No Gods, No Monsters benefits from the other two you've written, like I love that it is a trilogy, I do think it handles its thought experiment in isolation very well. And so kind of like how I asked, why the Virgin Isles? Why Boston for a lot of this? Like, obviously, it's all over the place. This is a very global story, but a large chunk of it's in Boston. I know you said 6 years or so there. Is that the large reason, or, is there anything else about Boston? I also love Boston. So that was just a thing that I loved, and I could see that, oh yeah, he's walked the streets of Boston. I know exactly where we are right now. So.
Okay. I mean, my answer to this isn't as good as the Virgin Islands. I mean, my Virgin Islands answer isn't that great either. But with the Boston thing, okay, so I promise this diversion will make sense. So when I was at Clarion West, it was a science fiction fantasy workshop. I was there in 2016. He wasn't an instructor, but he showed up. Sometimes this is in Seattle, and the way this workshop works, it's 18 writers, and every week a new instructor shows up to handle the workshop, to facilitate the workshop for that week. And so you get 6 instructors, it's 18 of us, and this is different now, but at the time we were all in this like sorority house together, so it was kind of like real world writing edition or something. And I had really great instructors. Stephen Graham Jones was a great instructor. Week 2, I think. Jameson was an instructor, which was wild to me. I was a fan then. But it wasn't any of them. Ted Chiang showed up because he lives in the area, or he lived in the area. I'm not sure where he is now. And he just showed up to the house. This would just happen. People would just show up. And I had read, partly, as I was preparing the lesson, I had read Story of Your Life. It was another first contact, thing that I had, grabbed onto. And I was studying linguistics at the time. And so I was very excited about how, Ted Chiang was like applying like linguistic ideas into this alien first contact story. And so I asked him about like how did you approach this, and like all of these moving parts in the story. And one of the things that he said was, I spent 7 years on it, right? I read a lot. And so he talked about the linguistics part, having read having the mission of reading as much of this as possible, this subject as possible, to inform the writing that he was doing. And so he did a lot of reading on linguistics. But he also talked to a lot of women, specifically because of the mother and daughter relationship that's explored in that story. And he interviewed women, and he had a lot of conversations about how it feels to be a mother and how it feels to be a daughter and all of this stuff, right? Because this is not his lived experience. I just felt like it was just this really responsible way of approaching it. And it was the first time that I had that the idea presented to me that you could approach something in this kind of journalistic way. You could talk to people. And I took that idea away. And when I was working in Convergence Saga, um, I had borrowed so much from my personal experience for the lesson and from reading and all this stuff. And I knew I wanted to write about a place that wasn't just the Virgin Islands. The Virgin Islands is in there too, but like I knew I wanted to write about somewhere else. And I was like, well, I'm here. I can walk the streets, right? Like, and I would walk the streets, and I had like a recorder, and I would describe what I was looking at. I would look things up. I would read about it. I would take a ton of pictures. I did all of that stuff, kind of like just to kind of cement myself in place. But I also talked to people, right? Like I did journalism, to like build this thing that I didn't really feel particularly confident in personally, because even though I've lived a lot of places, I never really feel completely at home or confident about a place in the same way that I feel about like the Virgin Islands. And that is kind of like over the years has atrophied quite a bit. So I don't really feel like I'm at home anywhere. But that really was helpful for me to kind of like give myself some grounding and to build something as best as I could that I felt like was that was borrowing from realism. And so yeah, it was partly convenience, but also partly like, okay, well, if I'm here and I'm working on this thing, how can I make this thing that I'm working on relate back to this place that I'm in some meaningful way. All right. And so I did a lot of work to try to do that. I got very interested in the cooperative scene in the Boston area. And so I would attend meetings. There's several co-op organizations. And so like that was a part of it too, right? Like I was like, what does Boston have uniquely that would influence the work in the same way that like I was thinking about that with the Virgin Islands and the lesson.
Well, not to. I was actually trying to think of the word because as you were talking, I'm like, oh yeah, there's a thing I want to ask because you were talking about the forming this community throughout the three books, and you latch on to cooperatives and you don't let it go the entire trilogy. I mean, in every sci-fi and fantasy author, they do this thing when they're trying to create a new world, and sometimes it's the standard stuff we've seen before, just like leaving feudalism and going to democracy. But you and Ken Liu do some really interesting society world building. And I guess I was wondering, you kind of already answered it, but I was wondering, like, how did cooperatives like come into this story? Because I learned so much about cooperatives just like secondhand while reading these works. So is there anything more on top of that that made you kind of like go, yeah, this is kind of what I would like this community to lean on as they're trying to get their sea legs?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. It's really great. So many things I could say about this. Um, I didn't know about cooperatives until I was in North Carolina. Like I was working on some science fiction stuff, and I had this thought about like this community, this housing development, um, marginalized community, living like working poor, predominantly using some system of um, I didn't have cooperation yet as language, but like working together and forming businesses that they could use, a lot around driving and cooking and doing and like artsy related stuff, right? Like things that they could use to get resources from outside and bring it back into the community and build the community up, right? And so a community using cooperativism. Now I would call that like an open value network, but I didn't know that then, right? And so I was working on it, or I was just in the beginning part of like kind of like brainstorming it, and then I got interested. I was like, this must exist somehow, and so I looked it up. I was like, people working together democratically, owning, and like I don't remember like the search words I put together, but it was so close enough to cooperatives that cooperatives showed up, right? And then it was like from there it was just like an obsession of mine. Like I just started reading a lot about cooperatives. I joined this like collective, long-standing collective that's a part of the cooperative community that writes about cooperatives, and they also host conferences for co-ops and stuff like that. and many of the members of that group are members of co-ops. And so I spent some time with them, and the Sen Collective in No Gods No Monsters is very much influenced by the Geo Collective. So I'm borrowing directly from reality in that way. But while I was in that collective, this is a really long way of answering this question. I started grabbing onto this idea of cooperative art, not only like art that is cooperative, but also art about co-ops, and the fact that there's not a lot of it, and that this is such an amazing idea of like democratically owning and governing your own businesses, your own house like homes. Like there's like cooperative housing, there's cooperative banks, there's cooperative businesses, there's cooperative organizations. Sometimes they're federated, so there's co-ops within co-ops within co-ops. And there's places in the world where there's really like advanced, long-standing like cooperative communities. Like the biggest co-ops are in Europe, right? And America is kind of like a baby in the sense that like we're still building that cooperative community. Um, and so I just got really interested in like, well, there should be art about this stuff,
Yeah.
so that people would be interested in it, and so that it could be a source of empowerment for people, right? Like this idea of like owning things together and building together and doing it in such a way that it's not like some like top down structure where most of the money stays at the top. Is that the money is dispersed in the middle, right? Like the people that own it are also the people working there. And I wrote some essays about that for Geo. They're on the Geo site, media cooperativism. And I talked to them a lot about it. I probably annoyed the heck out of them because I kept bringing it up. I was like, there needs to be like art about co-ops, and and there needs to be cooperative art, in like art. People need to work together cooperatively to create art. And they were like, yeah, sure. And when I was working on the Convergence Saga, I'm going to try to wrap this up. I I got very interested in like, well, what are one of the ways that monsters might remain hidden in a world like this, and how would they support themselves once they're out in the open? Like, how would they prevent themselves from being in precarious situations, right? And so cooperativism seemed like a really good idea. So like monster cooperatives was the germ of the idea. And it's like, this is how they support and build each other up. This is how they offer each other protection through economics. And it just grew and grew and grew. It's like this vein throughout the whole story. It's like that's the reason the well, I'm not going to say that because that's a spoiler, but like that's the reason a lot of things exist, is because there's this history. It's kind of alternate history in that sense, that there's this longer, deeper history of cooperativism, specifically within the monster part of society.
Yeah. And that's like a perfect segue into our more like my more like fun sci-fi fantasy question. I know paranormal is always like right on the edge of both. And you actually do have some direct sci-fi elements that I might ask you about in a bit because it'll be slightly more spoiler territory. But in general, I feel like most people know this is like a paranormal urban fantasy. Like I don't think I feel comfortable telling people it's like an urban fantasy because it's not going to be your standard detective story, or like it's not Buffy. It's not what people associate, but we're in a city. We have hidden monster society. That's the urban fantasy. So what did you pull from for all your paranormal creatures? Because you don't just pull from Western creatures. You're all over the globe. Everything you're pulling from, and also just like because you have eldritch kind of societies. You got werewolves, vampires, gods, things that I can't remember the names from, but I thought were really cool, like the hurricane kind of, not werewolves things. I can't remember their names right now. But what's your favorite, and like what did you do to collect all of these monsters to put together in this work?
So the werewolves and vampires are pretty standard fare, right? Like I think everybody will feel very comfortable with that stuff. Witches too. There's some witches in there. There's also some mages, or what I'm calling mages. Um, but I also was interested, like I had more ambitious goals for this than actually made it to the page. So I wanted to pull from a lot of different cultures and folklore, to kind of develop the monster societies. But I felt less comfortable doing that in certain ways, right? Like, and so like I kind of was more careful to not appropriate in a way that if I wasn't going to do it properly and give it like its full treatment, I tried to shy away from it. Not to say that I don't pull from things. I just pull from things in a way that um was more careful than I initially intended. But then I also pulled from Caribbean folklore a ton. So like some of the monsters that I'm writing about in that aren't recognizable immediately are Caribbean folklore monsters. Some of them are like hybrid, where they're influenced by Caribbean stuff, but then they're kind of like invented in some ways. And then some of them are entirely made up. Like I was like, let me just have fun with this then. And so I just like made up some things. There isn't a lot of um with the exception of the mages, there aren't a lot of like completely invented monsters. But like there's a character named Dragon, and I was like, well, shifters are a thing. I want to do a shifter, but I want to do an unconventional shifter.
Yeah.
And so Dragon became my unconventional shifter. And then I, played with some other things in terms of shifters and that sort of thing. And so, yeah, I was pulling from a lot of different places. I was pulling a lot from pop culture, to be honest. And then where I wasn't, I was pulling from the Caribbean and the African diaspora. So like I grabbed some things that I felt comfortable enough pulling from because they are a part of Caribbean history. I was just kind of like, let me migrate some things a little bit and build some stuff here. And because of that, I was just thinking, one of the things that is explored in the books is this like, two different streams or two different routes of for monstrosity.
Yeah, that
And
was so cool.
uh, right? Yeah, I thought I was very excited about it. Like one is like very community oriented, and one is more I would say like Western, this kind of like individualist monster building structure thing. And yeah, it was exciting to kind of think about that, like cultural influence for monster um lineages, right? And so that was pretty cool and fun.
No, that was a really fun world building thing you did there that I'll be vague about because it is something that you kind of get to discover in We Are the Crisis specifically, and it's very cool, and I love that. That was kind of a very fun organic way to like learn about that part of the world. Oh, I had another thought. So you already kind of answered another question I usually have is like, what element didn't make it into the series that you wish you did? And so you were kind of like a bunch of these creatures, but was there something else that you're kind of like, man, I wish I could have fit this in, but the trilogy wouldn't have been served best if I'd squeezed that in there?
I think just more of things that made it in there sort of tangentially. So I wanted more of monster history. Um I kind of like gesture at it a lot, but I wanted to like go deeper. But I just, trilogies are hard and and deadlines, right? And so like I was like, what is necessary? And so like I kind of like did some weeding there. I also just wanted to do more stuff about the history of secret societies and more tying that back to monster societies and that sort of thing. But I did as much as I could within reason. And yeah, I think um I do wish I had more time with that stuff, but I also know that that stuff would have been the way I wanted to do that would have been maybe more infuriating to readers. Like I was just very interested. Like the way I wanted to do that stuff is like playing up the ambiguity of where things are coming from, and not necessarily like. So I was, part of early plan was to do history stuff, history of secret societies, but not in a way that would be like particularly informative, just like in like an exploratory way. I hope that makes sense. Um, where I was kind of tracing back where these things come from, but not confirming or denying anything as I was doing that. So because I didn't have as much time as I would hope, I was more direct than I hoped, which was probably for the better for the series. I think less readers will be angry at me because
I am happy with a direct answer once in a while. So I do think, at least
yeah.
me as a reader, I enjoy, because something I really love about the first two books in particular, because the third book's definitely doing the third book work of a trilogy of like, now we are weaving things together. Although all three books have a world building mystery, and you get the answer to each world building mystery. And I love that so much, because I am someone who really does like bumbling about in a world. And I do feel like my suspicion is you don't have time for that, because you also spend so much amazing time making us really understand these individual characters that we have. Because we do jump around to a bunch of different siloed groups of individuals, and they are just living their lives. And that's my favorite part. I think it's the thing you lose a tiny bit in the third book, because we have to do third book things. Like, that's just where the third book has to hit the climax and solve the problems and all of that. But I really love that you spent time there. So before we get into a question, well, so I don't think this is going to be a huge spoiler, but I did just mention that one of the fun things for me as a reader for reading No Gods, No Monsters was discovering a world building element. But I don't necessarily think it's a spoiler. But if you're a reader who up to this point has really been enjoying this, you really want to read No Gods, No Monsters, maybe bow out, come back later after you've, read the first book. But I was wondering, when did you decide to include a multiverse element, and how important do you think the lesson is for readers to read for the third book, in your opinion, as the creator? I have an opinion as the reader, but
Oh man, the big question. The multiverse element was early. It was pretty early on. I think before I started drafting, the multiverse element had made it into the story. It wasn't like the first thing to arrive in the outlining process, but it came very early. And part of the reason why, I'm trying to figure out how to talk about this. So I mentioned a while back in this conversation that when I first came to the MFA, I was submitting stories that were like really out there.
Mhm.
And they all had to do with this cosmology I had been building my head from before the MFA. And there was all of these characters in it that that I first started writing about during my MFA time, and then I kind of pulled back and I came down to earth a bit, and the lesson kind of became like a big part. The lesson and some short stories that were like more, I would say, domestic, more personal, more quiet. And now I love that, right? Like this is a thing that is a big part of what I want to do and continue to do. But that cosmic stuff, that cosmology stuff, has always been kicking around in the background of everything I'm doing. And so, because of the cosmology, the multiverse aspect came very early, because it was always there, right? Even when I was working on the lesson, I knew that the lesson was connected to things. And I had written short things that were connective tissue to the lesson and its relationship to larger cosmological things, right? The Ina have this like relationship to the universe, where they view the universe itself as a great adversary. And that was also something that was intentional. I wanted to explore and play with and expand, like the idea that the universe um, could be seen or viewed as alive.
Yeah.
Right. So that built, and the way that I write is that like I write something and then I write something else, and then I build connections to things that I've written before. I just keep doing that. It's a thing that I think I consider to be what's the word that I'm looking for? Compulsion. I guess a compulsion. Like sometimes I shouldn't be doing it, and then I'm like, oh, I've done it again. Um, and so yes, multiverse came early, and um, I already knew when I was working on No Gods No Monsters where I knew exactly what the last scene of the series would be, and I knew who would be there. And I knew it would be connected to all of these larger, bigger things. And through No Gods No Monsters and We Are the Crisis, there's a bunch of seeds of things, right? There's like things people would say, things people would do. Sometimes people would show up and you're like, who's that person? And it's just like, well, yeah, it's connected to this larger thing. And so, yeah, all of that was very intentional. I don't know the answer to the second question. I think maybe yes. Um, the answer to the second question, the question being, should you read the lesson? Probably, probably. I shouldn't do this, but I did like read uh, a review of the arc where someone was like, I really like this, but I didn't like the introduction of this new universe. Like, I don't know why that was there. I was like, oh boy. Well, if a reader's having that experience or response, then it tells me that like they probably would need to read the lesson to I'm talking about this. I don't know how to talk about this without like talking
No, I mean,
about it.
I think that makes
Yeah.
sense. So for I might have a little. I'm very experienced in spoiler-free discussing things. The reason why it might behoove most people to read the lesson is because if you read A Ruin Great and Free, I think it's actually the first chapter or the prologue, you get introduced to a new perspective in a different part of the multiverse. And if you haven't read the lesson, you don't know that we've met those people and we've been on that world before. And so a lot of the heavy lifting is just already done in a incredibly well written, like 290-page book. But if you don't have that context, you might feel like you're scrambling a bit more. And for me, it was really
Yeah.
cathartic seeing how some of these arcs, and so in some ways bittersweet, because there were some arcs that happened that I was kind of, I don't know, I just didn't anticipate some characters making the decisions they did. It was just one of those things. So that's why I think people should probably read the lesson, but I'm also biased in that I think I read the lesson in an entire day and it was the best company I'd ever had. So, like, you know, I don't think it's that big of a chore to read. It's not like you're writing 600-page tomes over here. Like, these are all very reasonably sized, well put together novels. So,
Yeah,
the
I don't know
credit,
if I can even write a 600 page. I might attempt it one day. I just feel like I try to write long and then it ends up being short. But yeah.
no, I mean, but here is the well, actually, I have one more question before a dreaded question. So, because I
Okay.
noticed that I do think I love your writing the most when it is domestic, and I feel like you're most at home in domestic, but then you do write these bombastic climax scenes. And so, do you feel like you're using like different tools to write those huge action-packed climax scenes versus the domestic? Do you enjoy your time there? Does it feel foreign? Like, how do you approach that? Because they're very different styles, and it happens in all your books.
Mm, mm. Well, I mean, now I'm doing the thing that your husband
No,
does, where
it's totally
I'm pausing to think. I I do find action scenes very difficult, right? Like I think that like the thing that I tend to avoid for a really long time is an action scene in a book. Like climaxes are intimidating for me. Um, but it's one of those things where it's genre. I don't know, like genre stories tend to have actiony climaxes, especially like modern ones. And so it's one of those things where I'm like, well, I'm trying to reward the reader that wants that stuff, like I'm like, here's an action scene if you want one, like and I don't always find them comfortable, but sometimes I enjoy the process of them. It's not always true. Like so like I really enjoy the process of writing the climax for No Gods No Monsters. And in my mind it's being it works best when I'm like in the emotional state of the characters, like the experience, that very close experience of what's going on. And so there's a lot of big things happening in that scene, but it stays very close to the character. And so I enjoy that. And I think that, like, as long as I'm not losing sight of what's important to that individual, then those action scenes, I feel, are quite effective, right? Like, I have different grades for different climaxes for each of those books. A Ruin, Great and Free is very has a very big, very long, very bombastic action climax, and I feel like it has to be because it's also the climax of the Convergence saga. And oh, I remember a thing I wanted to say. I'll get back to it, but yeah, it's big and bombastic because it kind of has to be, but it's also um I try very hard to stay close to the characters, and when I can't, to um to focus on like what things look like and feel like, and focus on what I think people will respond emotionally to. um I read a lot of writers that are really good at action, and really good at blocking, and making things feel very kinetic. And I'm envious of that ability. Um, my When I write action, it tends to be kind of quick and brutal most of the time if I'm not doing it in climax. Um, but and I do like that. I like that, like, I feel like action in real life isn't slow, and like tactical in the way that you might watch in an anime. People, like, a fight is over pretty quickly. And
Yeah.
so I like playing with that. But giving readers what they want for those climax. And because I want those climaxes to be big events that tie together the rest of the mosaic, um, I tend to build towards them, and tend to write them as, big set pieces, so that the reader will remember that, yeah, this was where all those threads were going. This was what it was building towards. Like, because I do know that I write in the beginning of stories, these novels in particular, a path that is hard to follow, right? And so the climax is doing two things. It's trying to give readers what they want. Like, here's your reward for sticking with me so long. But also, like, these are all the players that you've seen, remember, and now they're in this moment together, or they're close to each other, experiencing this event that was being built from the very beginning of the novel. So I don't know if I'm answering the question. Like,
No, I think you are.
yeah, the
No,
domestic moments build. You need to know these people, so that when they're in the climax, you care about the climax, is the way that I think about it, versus that, another person would write a climax or write these action scenes as, like, these action scenes need to be exciting within themselves. And I'm more like, you're invested because of these people. Let me try, because that's where my skill set lies. Let me try to, like, render these people as well as possible within this moment.
And I agree, it just because I'm the type of reader, and I mean, it's so nice how you think of us so often. I feel like you're allowed to be more indulgent, if you want. But I'm not someone who loves an action scene because I don't visualize them. Like, someone could block it perfectly, and like I wouldn't know what's
Mhm.
happening. But because you do focus each of your moments on characters' emotions and how they're responding, and like there are things that you do in the third book that I'm still not okay with in your climax scenes. But that, like you said, that investment is only there because I have traveled with these characters, and like I know how they take their coffee in the morning and stuff like that. Like I know how they would want to exist in the world if they weren't put in these larger than life circumstances. So
Right.
I really appreciate that. Now, you said you had something you wanted to say before I ask my final question.
Oh yeah. So I think the best way to say this, without spoiling too much, is that the Convergence Saga is officially 3 books, right? It's a trilogy, but I see the lesson as, like, the secret fourth book, right? So, even like the way, like, I think, like, if you put the lesson next to those 3 books, because I talked a lot with the publisher about this stuff, you can see that the lesson wants to be next to them, right? It's like, it's it's kind of a 4 book series, if the first book in the 4 book series has an identity crisis, or a better way of saying it is if the first book in a trilogy kind of has like a strained relationship with
Yeah.
the rest of the books.
No, yeah, I would probably. I don't know what I'll say when I make my should you reads. And actually, if you're watching this, the should you reads is already out. So I've already made a decision, but I've been trying to decide because, like, I just happened to read it No Gods, No Monsters, The Lessons, We Are the Crisis, A Ruined Great and Free. That just happened to be my reading order, which I thought was kind of great because it's like the two first books, like the two starting points. I don't know if I would have wanted to pause from We Are the Crisis to read The Lesson before diving into A Ruined Great and Free because I really wanted
Yeah.
to read A Ruined Great and Free after We Are the Crisis. Like, I haven't done that since I was in high school and I was reading like the Mistborn trilogy and I finished book 2 and I was like, I need the third book right now. I haven't done that very often in my life. So yeah, I don't know. I think though, I'm not, the Lesson might be my personal favorite. I don't know. I have to reread them all and I will one day, but I haven't committed yet. No Gods, No Monsters also, as I told you when we were setting this up, holds a special place in my heart as traveling with me across the Atlantic Ocean for the entire day.
Mm-hmm,
So
mm-hmm.
that's how I read that book. So, my final question, every author's dreaded question, even though you do not have to answer it, but what is next for us as readers? What is potentially on the horizon? Short works, novelettes, novel, trilogy?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. The dreaded question. So I want to say really quickly that it makes me very happy that you like The Lesson and that The Lesson is your favorite. Because I feel like I was learning so much through the process of making that one. Like I personally feel like, um, you know, authors sometimes try to create this like mystery around being an author and writing books, and I try to remember or remind myself that I'm a person first. And so I feel like it's okay to admit that, like, if I'm struggling with something or something was hard or something was like, um, looking back at something, it's like, oh, I wish I did that differently. The Lesson, I'm so proud of that book, but like, it's a first book. Like, I worked out a lot of things as I was working on it. And then I accepted a lot of things about it. Like, I think that you kind of have to do with your first attempt at a big novel that you're actually finishing all the way to completion, right? There was tons of novels I started that fizzled out, and so that makes me really happy. My personal favorite, like, if I could, they're not going to attack me, the books themselves, but like, my personal favorite is No Gods, No Monsters, because everything I wanted to do, I set out to do, that I told myself I was going to do, I I did, and I pulled it off reasonably well, which is my grade. Like, it's like reasonably well is good enough for me. Knowing that, like, I'm a work in progress myself, right? So like, um, no, We Are the Crisis and Ruin Great and Free, though I love them and I'm really proud of them, they are um those are books that I wrote on deadline while I was doing other things, right? So A Ruin Great and Free, I was working on while I was working on another trilogy that I worked on with 4 other writers. We're like a 5-person pseudonym. This is my cooperativism in art thing on the
Yeah.
other side. And We Had a Crisis, I had a full-time teaching job. I was a fiction faculty at NC State, and I had started this author collective that is not just the 5 of us; it's actually 22 writers at this point. And I was working on that book, and so it was just really hard. That book was really hard to do and finish and get to the end. And so there was a lot of things that I just had to accept about that book. So while I was working on No Gods, No Monsters, I was walking around Somerville. I was going to the library. I was sitting under trees. I had left that was my first that was the first time that I decided to write full time for a bit, and then I started working again. Um, and now I'm writing full time again. But that first time, The Lesson hadn't even come out yet, and so I was working on No Gods, No Monsters, and nobody was. My inbox was free. I wasn't getting any. No one was calling me up. Right, like, I wasn't traveling for events. No one knew who I was. I was just like a. No one knows who I am now. I'm not trying to say that. What I'm saying is that, like, um, I didn't have to go to a festival. I didn't have to go to a convention, or like, I wasn't, being asked to do some kind of event. And so it was just undistracted time. And my days was like, I would go out in the morning and I would catch the train, and I would go to wherever I wanted to like camp out for the day or half the day. And I would work, I would read, I would study, I would do research, I would take pictures, and I would write. And so that was just an idyllic time to work on something. I outlined everything. I knew what I wanted to do, and I did it. And then I revised it and revised it and revised it and revised it. Um, and I had no, like, I had done it, I had completed it early enough that I could do that before turning it in, right? And so like by the time I turned it in, I was like, well, this is the best I could do with this. And I did a lot of work with my editor too, but before my editor even showed up, I was happy.
Yeah.
And so part of that is the experience of writing it, and then part of it is like when I go back and read it, I can see that on the page. I'm like, you had time. Where I feel like in other things, it's just like you had to make some decisions. With the lesson, it was like you're starting out. You might not have the skills yet for this particular thing, but your attempt was there, and like I respect it. I'm talking to my like previous self there.
I
You know
would
what I
also,
mean?
I think I would extend the grace of there's going to be things in all those books that will be there that are benefits that might have been removed if you had the time.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
There's going to be
I
a
do think
rawness
that
to it in some ways. Like those sharp edges aren't always bad.
I agree. I agree. I think the lesson is sharper because I didn't have a ton of, I had made commitments to turn it in at a certain period to my agent. And so I wanted to write this whole history of the Virgin Islands through Mara,
Oh, that'd be
um,
cool. Yeah.
and spend a lot of time doing that. And I cut what I had of that because it was very like it was pretty prosy. It was dense, and there wasn't a lot to hold on to in that section. And my agent was like, "You should cut this," and I was like, "You're probably right." And so I cut it, and it was because I didn't have enough time to do the longer version of it that I intended. So I did this kind of like half measure that didn't turn out to be as good. It was kind of dry. It read like a history book. And
Mhm.
so, yeah, I think sometimes when you do have a deadline and you're trying to keep that deadline, you make very practical, pragmatic decisions that are actually to the benefit of the work itself, though you don't know it until later,
Yeah.
right? You go back and then you see it. Okay, to answer your question about what's next, I think it's gonna be a standalone. It seems like that's what it's building up to be, a standalone horror book.
Ooh, I'm
Um,
pumped now. I'm all in.
single POV, first time ever,
Oh man, that's
for a
bold.
novel. Yeah, I'm terrified. Which is weird. It's like another author might be terrified to write like a 12 POV novel, and I'm like, I do that all the time. Um, but but this is gonna be single person horror. Is gonna be sort of, I'm gonna file off the edges a lot here, but it's gonna be about ice. It's like a horror novel that
Okay.
is related to some degree to an ice-like organization, um,
Nice.
and it's going to have this kind of like eldritch, um, Lovecraftian horror that's kind of like a barnacle that has attached itself to this organization, and so yeah, that's what I think is going to happen. I had initially intended to work on love story, an afterlife love story that was like an ode to pop culture. That one thing I think needs to be a slower process. I just need to take my time with it and finish it, and then see if my current agent will actually like represent it, because I want it to be kind of weird. It's going to be a single POV too, but it's going to be structured like a essay collection, like a personal essay collection. So some of the sections I want to be like about subjects. So like there's like one section I want to be about three pop singers and like kind of like a comparison of their music. And then um the third pop singer is missing. Like it's a mystery about that pop singer. Um I would have to explain what the afterlife is like to like really contextualize that, but like it makes sense somehow. And then like I want to write like an essay about loop narratives, like narratives that are like people are stuck in like time loops, because that has something to do with the afterlife. The way the afterlife works is that you're stuck in your death year. So the year of your death like loops over and over and over and over again. But all of the people that die that year live in that looped death year, and they get to do what they want, but the world is on loop. So like cars drive, planes take off, all the things that happen every day of that year happen to the physical objects of that world. It's just like a mirror world of the looped time death year, right? Weird, but like it's about like, you know, a group of friends in that afterlife, and the main character really loves pop culture stuff, so he spends a lot of time talking about pop culture stuff in the midst of this afterlife road trip thing that they're doing. They're like driving around places, they're like going on planes to different places, they're like traveling the world. That's in this loop.
Nice. I mean, I'm incredibly excited, especially because the last few years I've really started to love horror. Like when you're talking about Stephen Graham Jones, love them, Victor
Mm-hmm.
LaValle,
Mm-hmm.
Tananaridu. Do. I mean, it's just such a good time. So thank you so much for spending time with me. If you guys want, I have the Should You Read link down below, as well as my other Science Behind the Magic interviews with other fantastic creators of these weird worlds. I do highly recommend the series. Obviously, I wouldn't spend time interviewing this lovely individual if I didn't. And I'll see you guys around.